In early 1429, a peasant girl rode out of Vaucouleurs escorted by a mere handful of men across enemy territory. Her name was Joan of Arc, and her mission was nothing less than the salvation of France. And within just a few months, that small escort would grow into an army that began to see her as a leader. But was she really a military commander, or was she just a figurehead, or even a pawn of the French Dauphin? We'll answer these questions breaking down Joan's role, her strengths, and her weaknesses as a military leader. But first, we need to explain how this peasant girl managed to convince the Dauphin to send her to battle. I'll try to keep this brief, but there are a couple myths that I need to expose first. If you're mainly here for an analysis of Joan as a commander, I've timestamped that section for easy access. For Joan, the road to Chinon was not easy. The group traveled mostly at night to avoid detection by the enemy, and much to Joan's displeasure, they also did not attend Mass at local churches until they were in French territory. During this trip, her companions remembered that Joan bore the hardships well, fording rivers and sleeping in the field without complaint. Even upon reaching Chinon, Joan did not immediately meet the Dauphin, Charles VII. In fact, there were around 2 days of delays. During this time, the Dauphin's advisors visited her multiple times, likely to ascertain her mission and gather information to report back to their master. At first, Joan was reluctant to speak with them. However, she quickly relented and told them that she was there to lift the Siege of Orléans and take the Dauphin to be crowned at Reims. From the record, it appears that the advisors were divided. Some of them believed that she was mad and should be sent home. Others seemed to feel that it was worth at least listening to her. Given these dissenting opinions, we might ask how she ever got to meet the Dauphin at all. And interestingly enough, it likely had little to do with any person present, but rather someone across the kingdom, none other than Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of Vaucouleurs. De Baudricourt had sent a letter to the Dauphin detailing her recent actions, as well as a testimony to the faith that she had inspired amongst the locals. It's quite likely that this letter, written by an experienced captain who commanded an important and dangerous fortress, was a deciding factor for the Dauphin. If the captain saw her as credible, then Charles would at least grant her an audience. It's also worth noting that the Dauphin's cause was in pretty dire straits. The renewal of the English-Burgundian alliance in 1427 had allowed a new English army led by the Earl of Salisbury to besiege Orléans in 1428. Strategically, Orléans was the last major city in northern France that was loyal to the Dauphin. From a morale perspective, it was the heart of the Armagnac faction, the faction that supported the Dauphin against the Burgundians. Thus, if the English captured Orléans, they'd essentially be capturing a clear path to Bourges, the Dauphin's administrative center, as well as the heartlands of Charles's domain. Combined with the morale impacts, this would likely have been the death knell for the Dauphin's cause. So it was in the context of this potential disaster that the Dauphin agreed to meet with the peasant girl who claimed to have been sent by God. This meeting is central to Joan's story, and yet it's also been highly romanticized. Maybe you've heard the traditional version before, where the Dauphin disguises himself as a noble and Joan instantly picks him out of the crowd. While this story certainly adds to Joan's holiness and mystique, it's likely untrue. In her own words, as remembered by her confessor Jean Pasquerel, she said, quote, "When the Dauphin saw her, he asked her name, to which she replied, 'Gentle Dauphin, I am Joan the Maid, and the King of Heaven commands that through me you be anointed and crowned in the city of Reims.'" Thus, from her own testimony, it was the Dauphin who first engaged with her, which would have been proper protocol for the time. In addition, other contemporaries do not mention anything about the Dauphin deliberately disguising himself. As Joan's audience occurred in the late evening, it's likely and suggested by some sources that the Dauphin had stepped to one side to confer with some of his courtiers, which might have given rise to this legend. If this were the case, it's quite likely that she was simply pointed in his direction by some of the sympathetic nobles. It is also likely that she already had an idea of what the Dauphin looked like. After all, she had traveled to Chinon with Colette de Vienne, the royal messenger who, due to his role and his job, almost certainly knew what the Dauphin looked like. The story of Joan picking the disguised Dauphin out of the crowd isn't commonly seen until the 16th century and was likely created to bolster her saintly image. And the stories get even more wild when it comes to the sign that she gave to Charles VII. Amateurs and even some historians have suggested that she revealed she was his half-sister or some secret vice that the Dauphin had. As with most myths around Joan, there is a much more logical solution, one that's grounded in her own words. And this solution isn't based in romantic intrigue so much as in religion. Guillaume Gouffier was an officer in the Dauphin's household, and he stated that the sign related to a silent, private prayer that the Dauphin had told him about later. According to him, the Dauphin had asked God to, quote, "If he were a descendant of the noble house of France, and that the kingdom should by right belong to him, might it please God to protect and defend him." And in fact, in answer to this, we have Joan's own remarks, once again recorded by her confessor. According to him, Joan told the Dauphin, quote, "I say to you, on behalf of the Lord, that you are the true heir of France and the king's son, and God has sent me to lead you to Reims for your coronation." To a deeply devout and desperate man like Charles, who heard Mass 3 times each day, this probably sounded like the literal answer to his private prayer, a prayer that only he and God would have known about at the time. This theory seems much more plausible to me, but what do you think? Let me know in the comment section below if you think that this could be a much more logical answer. Also, the Dauphin was not fully convinced that she was truly sent from heaven, and he ended up sending Joan to Poitiers, then the major seat of learning in his realm, to be examined by leading churchmen. And so for a few weeks, Joan remained in Poitiers, answering questions posed by the learned scholars and also having her virginity verified by the ladies of the court. We won't go into these tests too much. It suffices to say that Joan passed them all with flying colors. All the questioners agreed that she had nothing in her but, quote, "good, humility, virginity, devotion, honesty, and simplicity." With this official stamp of approval, Joan headed back to Chinon and from there to Tours, likely in late March or early April of 1429. It was also somewhere around this time that she started to send her famous letters to the English, demanding that they beg forgiveness and leave France. Unsurprisingly, the English lords reacted with a mixture of mockery and derision. In Tours, she was fitted with plate armor, which was priced at 100 livres. She also commissioned her famous banner, which deserves a mention since it would become iconic to her soldiers. Interestingly, despite its importance, no one knows precisely what her banner looked like. However, her confessor states that it was designed by her voices and that it displayed an image of Christ sitting in judgment and an angel holding the fleur-de-lis, blessed by Christ. According to the account books, the banner cost 24 livres. Other accounts describe the banner as white, red, or a combination of colors. But now, Joan was ready to take to the field in plate armor, armed with her banner and a sword, the reputed sword of St. Catherine. But the question still remains, what was her role? There are a range of theories here. Some see her as a true commander, equivalent to the likes of the Bastion of Orléans. Others take the opposite view that she was a pure figurehead. As usual, the reality is somewhere in between. The Dauphin's decision to assign 2 royal heralds to her retinue is pretty telling. Heralds performed an important official role in carrying orders and negotiations, so this is a sign that Joan had a measure of real authority. However, it's also clear from the march to Orléans that she wasn't privy to all the councils. The French lords tricked Joan into believing that she was marching straight for the English, when in reality the French relief army marched on a circuitous route to bypass the main English positions. When she found out, this infuriated Joan. This incident actually tells us a lot about Joan as a commander, at least her strategic knowledge. The army headed for Orléans consisted not just of fighting men, but also a large logistics train that was meant to resupply the besieged city. Joan's desire to march directly against the English has all the hallmarks of an overeager amateur. On the other hand, men like the Bastion of Orléans realized that attacking the English while weighted down with a large supply train was inviting disaster. They also understood that the primary mission of this army was to resupply the city. Their planning was a proper ordering of strategic priorities. So we can see here that Joan was certainly not exercising strategic command, and that was probably a good thing. The French would later need soldiers from Orléans as well as additional reinforcements to break the English siege. Had Joan marched directly against the English with just the initial army, the result would likely have been a disaster. Where Joan did shine was in her inspirational presence. The Duke of Alençon remembers her praying fervently with the soldiers, which he stated increased their ardor for battle. The Bastard of Orléans also urged her to enter the city to raise the morale of the populace and the defenders. What was more, Alençon noted that Joan vehemently chided soldiers if she caught them swearing or blaspheming. She also banned pillaging, and Alençon noted that himself and many others changed their behavior on her account. And in this way, Joan is playing a critical command role. Building cohesion, inspiring soldiers, and upholding good order are critical leadership tasks in any military. These are tasks that Joan performed well, and it seems that she had her own unique form of what we would now call command presence. And this wasn't just in camp. In fact, nowhere would Joan's command presence be more clear than on the battlefield. But before we discuss that, we need to discuss the overall situation at Orléans. As stated earlier, the siege had been going on since 1428, and contrary to popular myths, it wasn't going particularly well for the English. They had taken heavy losses storming the Tourelles, a key defensive bastion that guarded the main bridge into Orléans. When they had finally captured it, the French had managed to demolish key supports on the bridge, rendering a direct assault almost impossible. To compound English woes, the Earl of Salisbury had been killed when debris from a cannon struck him in the face. His replacement was the Earl of Suffolk, who opted for a long siege to starve the garrison out. Unfortunately, the English lacked the troops to fully encircle the city, and so relied instead on a system of fortified bastions and patrols to prevent resupply and reinforcement. This strategy was only partially successful. However, the most important factor was that the Bastard of Orléans had created a major rift in English-Burgundian relations. He had done this by attempting to surrender the city directly to the Duke of Burgundy. This was likely a measure to try to preserve the city, since it would have spared Orléans a devastating sack. The Duke of Burgundy tried to convince Bedford, the English regent, to accept the surrender, but Bedford refused. It's likely that he wanted to sack the city and reap the financial rewards from doing so. The Duke of Burgundy was so angry at his allies' refusal that he recalled the Burgundian contingent, which left the English with a dangerously small army, not even sufficient to execute the bastion and patrol strategy. The saving grace for the English was that things were going even worse for the French. While the English encirclement wasn't perfect, it was enough to stop most supply columns, which meant the city was starting to feel the strain. Moreover, morale was low amongst the garrison, especially after the Battle of Herrings, where an attack against an English supply column had ended in a humiliating defeat. Desertion was a major problem even amongst the senior nobles, and the morale situation was dire enough that many were saying that only a miracle could save the city. And Joan, clad in shining plate armor, her holy banner held aloft, would have looked exactly like a miracle. It's important to remember that in the Middle Ages, God's existence was taken as a fact. Not only did God exist, but he did manifest his favor through chosen individuals such as the saints. Remember that at this point, Joan had been endorsed not just by the Dauphin, but by some of the leading churchmen in the realm. Most French, especially the religious common folk, would have accepted these rulings as proving Joan's holiness. That she arrived unscathed with boatloads of food and reinforcements only enhanced her positive impact on morale. But Joan wasn't there to hand out food, at least not in her own eyes. She desperately wanted to engage with the English and was upset that the Bastard of Orléans refused to engage until more French reinforcements arrived. Indeed, it would be several days until fighting commenced. The first recorded action was on the 4th of May, 1429, when the French attacked the isolated bastion of Saint-Loup. This was likely done to secure a new route for French reinforcement and supply columns, and Saint-Loup was likely chosen because it was undermanned and isolated. Louis de Coute, who was her page at the time, recalled that, quote, "When the French saw Joan, they began to raise a shout and took the fortress." Once again, this sequence demonstrates Joan as a commander. On the one hand, her overeagerness is on full display. On the other, her command presence motivates the French soldiers to press home their attack on the bastion, delivering the first major French success in months. The next day, there was no fighting since it was Ascension Day, and Joan refused to fight on such a holy day. She did take the time, though, to send 3 more messages, 3 being a customary number, to the English commanders, repeating the same demands: they surrender and leave France. The English responded with further mockery, and the next day Joan was ready to act. However, as she approached the gates, ready to ride out, she was met by Raoul de Gaucourt, the governor, who informed her that the French captains had forbade any action on this day. Joan angrily told him that regardless of what the captains wanted, that the men-at-arms of the men of the city, possibly referring to the city militia, would attack the bastion of the Augustinians and would be victorious. The governor's response isn't recorded, but it's clear that Joan left the city with a large contingent of soldiers led by her and La Hire. So it's clear that not all the captains opposed her plan. The force used a bridge of boats to cross the river to the south bank, landing between the bastion of Saint-Jean-le-Blanc and the Tourelles complex. It's likely that they intended to isolate Saint-Jean-le-Blanc and capture it, though this was high risk as it would expose them to an attack from the rear from the Tourelles. In any event, it didn't matter as the English Captain Glasdale had abandoned Saint-Jean-le-Blanc already, pulling the garrison back to the Tourelles. Here, disaster nearly struck. Accounts are a bit confused, but it appears that the French, possibly led by Joan herself, launched a premature attack against the boulevard and outer work of the Tourelles. In doing so, they exposed their flank to shooting from the Augustinian bastion and were driven back towards the landing area. In fairness, it makes sense that Joan, the amateur commander, would make this mistake. The boulevard was often referred to as an outer work, likely an earthen rampart with a palisade, and so appeared easier to capture. An unschooled commander like Joan likely discounted the effects of being enfiladed by shooting from the Augustinian bastion. The French were forced back in confusion, pulling Joan along with them. The English launched a sortie, likely from the boulevard or the Tourelles itself, probably believing that the French could be trapped against the river and destroyed. However, Joan and La Hire moved to cover this retreat. While Joan's steward describes her charging the English with a lance, this is almost certainly a romanticized account. Other accounts state that Joan raised her banner and yelled, "In the name of God," which rallied the French. This is much more plausible given that Joan herself stated she carried her standard into battle to avoid killing people. The French abruptly rallied and counterattacked. This time they targeted the Augustinian bastion, capturing it in fierce fighting. With the battle over, the French force remained encamped in the bastion with food provided across the river by the citizens of Orléans. This battle really shows Joan in her element as an inspirational leader and demonstrates the effect that such a leader can have on a battle. Joan's actions had been instrumental in rallying the retreating French and rapidly turning them on their pursuers. Caught by surprise by this reinvigorated enemy, the English were the ones who were forced to retreat. In this case, Joan's command presence on the battlefield was a key factor in determining victory. This also set the English on the back foot. The Augustinian bastion was a critical component of the English siege works, providing mutual support to the Tourelles bastion, which was Joan's next target. That night, the French captains again tried to rein Joan in, sending her a message to tell her that they did not wish for her to attack the Tourelles the next day. A lot of people deride the French commanders, with some historians even branding them as the, quote, party of inertia or the party of inaction. But this isn't entirely fair, as it fails to consider the war thus far. The history of the 100 Years' War shows us clearly the danger of attacking English forces in a prepared defensive position. In fact, France's worst defeats were all in this context. Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt were all caused by overeager French commanders attacking prepared English armies. This is something that all of the experienced French captains would have known. Joan, having not been raised amongst French knights, didn't have these shared experiences. She only had her belief in God's mission as well as her recent experience, which told her that aggressive assaults by motivated soldiers could overcome defense. It was a belief that was also shared by many of the common soldiers, which also isn't surprising. Common soldiers usually lack access to the overall strategic picture and so are more heavily influenced by recent tactical developments. The relationship between Joan and the more cautious French captains is very interesting. Both parties actually benefited from this relationship, though neither would admit it. The caution of the French commanders tempered some of Joan's more dangerous impulses, while Joan's fervor inspired the French soldiers in a way that the established commanders couldn't. There are a few other examples of this in military history, and I'd be interested to see if you could think of any in the comments section below. In spite of any reservations, the French attacked the Tourelles the next day, and just as the captains feared, the English held on stubbornly. Joan moved energetically amongst the men, exposing herself to danger and urging them onwards, but to no avail, and around midday she was struck by an arrow in her shoulder. She was carried from the field, and French morale faltered while the English cheered, believing they had killed or incapacitated her. Instead, Joan returned to the battlefield as the arrow had not penetrated too deeply. She promptly set about encouraging the men again, but despite this, the English held on, even when the French lit a fire under a section of the Bastion. As night was approaching, the Bastard of Orléans informed Joan that he was going to order a retreat back to the city. Joan begged him to wait, and instead of retreating, the French withdrew a bit to get some food, water, and rest. This was very sensible, as the French had been fighting all day and were undoubtedly tired. The bastard remembered that Joan herself retired a little ways away to pray for about 15 minutes or so. After this, she returned with her page Jean de Aulon and a squire named Le Basque who bore her standard. The three entered the ditch that formed the first defenses for the Tourelles. Jean de Aulon remembered at this point Joan, quote, waved the standard in such a manner that others believed it to be a signal. At this point, the French rushed forward with such fervor that they carried the breastworks and the bastion quickly. Here, once again, we see evidence that Joan was a commander with real authority. Medieval banners were used to signal the advance or the retreat. The fact that the French rushed to attack when Joan waved her banner says that not only did she give orders, those orders were followed, and this makes her a commander every bit as legitimate as the Bastard or La Hire. And yet we could also see her naivety on display and how that naivety again worked in her favor. In many ways, Joan embodies the saying, professionals are predictable, amateurs are dangerous. I say this because the Bastard's plan to retreat to Orléans was tactically sound. Night was fast approaching and the French had made no progress on taking the Bastion. Retreating in the evening would be far safer than trying to retreat in the dark. In fact, this is likely what the English assumed that the French were doing, since it was tactically sound. After all, Joan was able to enter the defensive ditch with her clearly identifiable banner. If the English had been manning the defenses, she would almost certainly have faced a hail of arrows and crossbow bolts, yet she didn't. It's likely that the English had withdrawn a bit from the walls to grab food, water, and treat the injured, believing that the day's fighting was over. This would explain how the French assault, renewed with unmatched fervor, carried the bastion that had been so staunchly defended all day. As the English were rushing back to their defensive positions, the inspired French were already scaling over them. Certainly, the Tourelles fell, and that night the French set about repairing the bridge into Orléans. With the loss of their key bastions, the English siege of Orléans was effectively broken. What had taken the English months to accomplish had been undone in just over a week by a peasant girl, something that the English would never forgive or forget. In our next episode, we'll examine the Loire campaign as well as the Dauphin's coronation at Reims, and how Joan played a part in all of those events. We'll continue to focus on Joan as a commander. Importantly, we'll examine how her inexperience and strategic rigidity made her dangerous enemies, not amongst the English, but amongst the French. Until then, I hope you enjoyed this video, and take care until the next time.